the incremental, invisible process by which mission-driven cultures slide into high-control environments without anyone noticing, and how it rarely happens with bad intentions. What part is me, and what part is the team, the organization, societal messages, all the systems around us that are making it worse or better?
High levels of emotional intelligence actually correlate to the higher level of the ability to manipulate. It's not about a bad leader imposing their will and therefore the mission becomes a thing we subjugate ourselves to. The leader might be subjugated to it as well.
What if the wellness programs, the emotional intelligence training, and the mindfulness initiatives meant to support your organization are actually teaching people to ignore the signals that something is structurally wrong? And what if your mission-driven culture, the one meant to create social impact, is actually turning into a cult? Yeah. My guest today spent 2 decades leading wellness programs for international organizations, teaching mindfulness, training instructors, building cultures of care. She was exceptional at it until her body started sending concerning signals, panic attacks in the bathroom, a nervous system screaming that something was not right. She started digging into the culture of leadership and cult behaviors, and her insights have completely changed the way that she looks at the wellness culture as well as mission-driven organizations. Through her extensive deep dive into these areas, she's identified what she calls the drift, the incremental, invisible process by which mission-driven cultures slide into high-control environments without anyone noticing, and how it rarely happens with bad intentions. So in this episode, you will learn how to recognize when care becomes codependency, when generosity functions as control, and when courageous followership becomes the code for asking employees to compensate for leadership failures. And by the way, if you want to learn more about courageous followership, I'm going to add a link for you for a previous episode with Ira Chalef, who is the author and thought leader who wrote about this concept, so that you can sort of like start linking these ideas together. So if you've ever felt this dissonance between the language of psychological safety and the reality of structural control, if you've been told your resistance is reactivity, or if you are a leader genuinely trying to build trust, but you're noticing tension that you think could imply maybe some drifting around the things that we're talking about, this conversation will give you the frameworks to name what you've been feeling. So join us today as we examine the dark side of people-first leadership and what it actually takes to build cultures that expand rather than erode personal agency. I suspect today is going to be like mind-blowing for many of you. Hi, it's Dr. Mira Brancu, and welcome back to The Hard Skills. Our guest today is Candice Schutter. Candice holds a BA in psychology, a master's degree in social impact, and is currently completing an MS in organizational leadership at Arizona State University. She has a highly successful podcast, The Deeper Pulse, which among the many, many episodes she's produced, over 50 actually episodes, are dedicated to the cult culture. It is absolutely fascinating. I'm obsessed with her podcast. It's exceptional. It's thoughtful. It's well-researched. And I'm super excited to have her on the show today to talk about some of that information. Welcome, Candice.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction and for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. Very excited to get into this.
Yay.
So let's start with your story. You spent 2 decades in the wellness industry and in leadership roles within it. Tell us, what would you put into the wellness industry as like, what goes into the wellness industry? We hear a lot about wellness this, wellness that. What's included? And then also, what kind of leadership roles did you have within it?
Yeah, so as far as the industry at large, it really kind of depends on who you ask, like how broadly it's defined. One thing I find really fascinating is that in the last decade, especially the last 5 years, the industry has grown exponentially and it now surpasses big pharma, which is what it was sort of, its mission was to offset the exploitations and the problems within big pharma. And now it has become its own commercial enterprise that far exceeds the big pharma. So that's just a super interesting tidbit for folks to know out there. So because of that growth, when I started, wellness was a little different than what it is now. Like wellness is now a massive commercial enterprise that includes everything from fitness and wellness brands to supplements to what we call large group awareness trainings, where different brands create training programs that people can move through for personal development, for health. And usually those two are kind of conflated together. So it really depends on who you ask, but it's a very large umbrella in terms of the things that fall beneath it. And I specifically, when I got involved, it was after dabbling in college, I will say, in spirituality and things of that nature, I really fell into the wellness world through a particular mind-body fitness practice in 2000. In 2001, I became certified as a part of that practice. And then by 2003, I had uprooted my entire life and moved to the epicenter of the organization because I was offered a management position to manage their international training headquarters. This was a company that trained teachers in over 100 countries and had, at the time, I think there were about 1,500 licensed teachers. Not very many trainers at that point. The two founders of the practice were sort of in charge of everything, which sort of led to some of the problems. But I worked for them in what we actively called the inner circle of the company. And I was there only, I guess, 3 to 5 years. It was a long extrication for me. And then from there, I bounced into, because I wanted a sense of agency, which we'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. And I thought I could reclaim it by becoming a consultant and a coach on my own. But I was still sort of under the spell of what we'll talk about today. And I was just reenacting and reinforcing many of the same dynamics, just in a leadership role. So I worked within leadership in the organization, and then I became a consultant, coach, and leader working with other organizations for a number of years before I eventually sort of shifted my focus to what I'm doing now.
Super interesting. And I think many of us can probably understand the supplement industry alone as one of these things that can be quite predatory, especially of vulnerable populations. But we don't really think about other areas within wellness that you described as potentially falling within that domain, or how they could slide into that. So I'm excited to hear more about that. When did you start wondering whether there was something wrong? Was it when you started having panic attacks and your body started screaming at you? Was it before? Did you see signs of concerning experiences?
Yeah, it was kind of both and I mean, very early on when I got involved in the first organization where I spent the most time working in leadership under their umbrella, I had, that spidey sense you have when you look back. You don't really totally register it in the moment, but the gut's always working and kind of sending you signals. And so there were some things that I thought in terms of the leadership structure that felt a little off to me, and really a sense of integrity around the way that the work was taught and the mission that we were all buying into, and how certain people walked the talk and others didn't. And mostly it was the people in the higher ranks that weren't walking the talk so much. And what became sort of the biggest red flag for me when I really started working in management was that there was a lot of lip service around, because let me back up a second. We were all about, it was a mind-body fitness practice. So it was about fitness and body awareness, but it was also very much, the practice had appropriated a lot of things from emotional intelligence training and from popular psychology and from a lot of different things, and kind of brought it into the training. And the way it was in the workplace is that we were all expected to maintain certain standards in terms of the way we engaged, the way we communicated, how much self-awareness we were expressing, and how we regulated ourselves. There were very high standards on us, the employees and middle management. But when it came to the tip top of the pyramid, not so much, right?
Mm-hmm,
So that was the biggest disconnect for me. And what would happen would be that I would once I got really in there and I was working with the executive team very closely, I would go into a meeting and something would happen and their rather domineering style, well, it was sort of cloaked in love and light, but it was a very dominating style of leadership would emerge. And looking back, I know to call it was verbally abusive the way that I would be treated, but it was always framed as an opportunity for me to grow, an opportunity for me to self-regulate, an opportunity for me to stand in my power and push back against what was coming at me. And I had really, really internalized the work to such a degree that I thought it was on me. So my instincts were there, but I had so internalized the identity of being a chosen person who got to work so closely with leadership. And I really wanted to follow their advice. So I just continually discounted that spidey sense I spoke about and reframed it in sort of wellness speak and opportunities for me. It was always about what I needed to do to change. And I didn't look structurally at what they needed to do.
That sounds so confusing to try to extract yourself or understand what's happening. And I know that you had this experience of, at a time when you were told to, sort of address something with therapy and to address your trauma, and that it felt like caring, but it really wasn't caring. So tell me more about this sort of message of wellness and that it's on you and that you can be fully empowered, and yet it feels off.
Yeah. So it was actually pretty early on in my time in, I call this organization the org on my own podcast and easy shorthand. It was early on during my time there where, because of these interactions that I was having with management, there was this sense of, if only Candice would become strong enough and have enough agency to be vocal and stand up to us. They wanted to tussle. They wanted me to challenge and push and engage in ways that quite honestly aren't my style of dealing with tension. And they wanted me to meet them in that way. And I would start to react and I would become very dysregulated. I would sometimes freeze, or I would fawn at them, or even when I felt because I've always had a really strong sense of self. And so I really did challenge them from time to time, but I would become very dysregulated when I did it. And so the message from them became, oh, well, you just need to work on that, your ability to regulate yourself and to stay calm in the face of our, quite frankly, verbal abuse. You need to be able to stay steady. So what we'll do is we will, and I should add to this, I was also working for a very mediocre salary based on my experience. I was underpaid and I was stressed about money. There was a lot of things playing into it. And so they said, well, we'll pay for you to go to therapy. And I felt like, oh my God, I work for the best company in the world. Like, they're going to pay for me to go. I mean, this was in 2003. Like, that didn't happen, right?
Yeah.
So I thought, this is incredible. So they sent me to a therapist. And interestingly enough, the therapist was somebody who had worked with them and had worked with other people in the company. So even though it wasn't an offshoot of our company as a resource, he knew a lot about the systems. And I will never forget one thing he said to me early on. It took me a while to really understand it in an embodied way, but he said, Candice, I think what happens there is that they mistake intensity for intimacy. And they want you to do that dance with them. Because what would happen is they would have a conflict, and then it would get all warm and fuzzy at the end when they made up. And they wanted me to do that with them. So the therapist kind of helped me to start to see, like, oh, wait, there is something structural and there's something systemic and something a little bit toxic about this workplace. And it's not all on me. But at the same time, when I would go to my bosses, and they didn't pay for it long, I should say, maybe because I was having other insights, but the CEO actually of the company, he was the biggest quote unquote trigger for me. We used that language, like he was my trigger. He offered to come to a session with me. And when I look back on it now, that's madly inappropriate. But at the time, it felt like love. It felt like caring. It felt like we were walking the talk.
Yeah. What I'm already sort of picking up on, there's three things I wrote down as signs in case like folks are listening and trying to make sense of it. Number one is there's a lot of lip service by the leaders about a healthy environment, but among them or the way that they act, it does not seem to match what they're saying. There's something off. The second is you mentioned a freeze or fawn response. For those of you who are new to this, it's a threat response, usually to stress or a threatening situation. Often people with trauma experience this, but like we all experience threat responses. And those threat responses are usually either we are the kind of person that freeze, we're in the moment, we don't know what to say, we're just like, deer in headlights, and we wait until the moment dissipates, or we flee. We want to get out of there. We want to sort of like get away from the situation. Sometimes we fight. So we want to get into it until we figure it out. And or fawn is the one that most people don't know about, which is bringing them closer in order to dissipate the situation. Either way, if you find yourself in a threat response, that is something that to really sort of alert you, like I'm feeling under threat here. Why am I feeling this way when they're saying and doing all the right things, like offering me therapy and supporting me and paying for my therapy and et cetera, et cetera. And then the final thing that you mentioned was a boundary violation. Saying I can come to therapy with you when you're somebody's employer does not make any sense. That's a boundary violation, right? It's getting too intimate.
Yep.
And so, this experience of I want to care for you in ways that don't make sense within the construct of an organization as compared to a family or an intimate relationship you would have outside of that.
Right. Yes,
Yeah.
that's a great summation. I just want to add, I think whenever there's, and we'll get into like, the downsides of emotional intelligence, how it can be misused. But one of the things that I think is really important to note when we're talking about what I would, call manipulation of this sort is that there's always a modicum of truth, right? I mean, it is true that I came from a traumatized family and that I did have a trigger around certain kinds of authority expressions. And those things were all true. And also, this was happening, this disorganized attachment that they were, feeding into. So I think that's really important for those of you listening who might be like, well, but it is true that and it's like, absolutely, that can be true. Two things can be true at once.
Yeah, I think that makes it even harder. It makes it much harder because when you have certain things that you're working on, and we all do, the most important thing is, and I talk about this all the time, is teasing apart what part is me and what part is the team, the organization, societal messages, all the systems around us that are making it worse or better, right? And so knowing where you stop and something else starts takes a lot of awareness, inner work, etc., and understanding of how the social ecosystem around you is working as well, which is really hard when you're in the moment. It's really hard to tease apart. Yeah. Since you already started mentioning the emotional intelligence piece and how it's misused, let's go there. I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah. So, and I had inklings of this as I was, doing my research for the podcast and interviewing. I mean, I've interviewed dozens and dozens of people about these types of dynamics. And it wasn't until I was really digging into this current grad program that I'm in, and I had studied emotional intelligence, like I said early on, as part of my wellness journey, that I really started to look at it in an academic sense and the way that it is sort of prescribed to organizations as this wonderful tool. And I want to say wholeheartedly that I think emotional intelligence is fabulous. It's transformed my life, having self-awareness, having awareness of others, social awareness, the ability to relate with others, like all the aspects of emotional intelligence are absolutely key. And just like anything, something can be used as a tool or it can be inadvertently. And I want to emphasize everything I'm talking about here today. I'm not talking about folks with bad intentions, just the opposite. How with good intentions, we can take a tool that's really wonderful and helpful, and we can misappropriate it and use it in ways that are harmful. So when I talk about the dark side of emotional intelligence, and there's lots of research, not a lot, there's a few really significant studies have been done on this, not quite enough, but I had to dig and find it, but they're there, that really supports how the same skills that make us really adept at being self-aware and socially aware can also make us really good at manipulation, right?
Yes.
They can be used in other ways. And I'm sure most of you listening out there have had an experience of that, of like where you have an interaction and suddenly you look back on it and you're like, how did that happen? Like, wow, that person's really clever. It's not just charisma that gives people the ability to manipulate us. Emotional intelligence has actually been found in the research. High levels of emotional intelligence actually correlate to the higher level of the ability to manipulate. So that's sort of the thing I like to flag. And the ways in which that I saw that show up a lot in wellness arenas, because there was a lot of emotionally intelligent people running around leading and following. One was something we already mentioned, emotional intelligence, like the language of it being sort of turned on the person who's raising the concern, right? So me raising a concern about the way that I'm treated in a meeting becomes an issue that I should deal with because fill in the blanks around emotional intelligence and what I should be looking at. It's used as a tool of deflection.
Yeah.
Another one that I think is really key, that I think is what I wanted to bring forth for our conversation today, that I think applies to a lot of different organizations, is that wellness programs can actually become a strategic way to teach people how to tolerate what should be intolerable. So we become rewarded and celebrated for our ability to power through, to handle our stress, to, make it to that deadline, even though we had to work all those extra hours. And but we're masters in our self-regulation. So we were able to do it. Like things of that nature, I think is one of the most important things to point to for our conversation, is the way that can happen. And sort of adjacent to that is the language of psychological safety sort of becomes lip service to having this open door policy where all things get aired out, but nothing structurally ever changes. So it gives leadership the sort of a pass to say, well, we have these programs, or well, we have an open door, but the actual structural issues that are leading people to burnout or leading people to have to take extra stress management courses aren't actually ever dealt with. So those are sort of the main things. And then, of course, it goes without saying what I mentioned before, that self-regulated leaders are much better at getting what they want out of their followers, for better and for worse.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a number of things I'm thinking about here. One is, I sort of talk about this in kind of similar ways in my workplace politics books, which is that workplace politics and navigating workplace politics technically is a neutral thing, right? Understanding and navigating politics is neutral. However, what we're most familiar with is how it's misused and what is misused. And so within the sort of among the people who are very politically savvy, you could use it for honest, positive change, and you could use it for self-serving, dishonest means. And it requires the same skills. It requires emotional intelligence and understanding how to navigate systems and how to use resources. But if you use it for self-serving, means and for dishonest means, right? I want to extract money from people, for example, and I want it for myself, or I want people to just follow what I say and I don't actually care what they have to say, or whatever. I want to get promoted and I don't care how many people I step on, then it is misused for your own political gain and your own promotion and your own money gain and whatever it is. However, you can use the same exact skills, knowledge of the systems, knowledge of how to leverage resources, emotional intelligence, to gather people around, a problem, a community of people around a problem, empower them to figure out how to bring out the best in them and how to find the resources and how to sort of leverage resources together and make a massively positive impact. The problem is that you need to know how to do that well, and you need to know when you're misusing those skills. And what I heard from you is there is a piece of this that is very, even for well-meaning people, it can become self-serving. Like if you don't want to actually get into solving a problem because it's stressful for you, because it's scary because you don't enjoy conflict, then you might tell other people how to manage themselves so you don't have to deal with it. Right? Manage your emotions because I don't want to deal with it. This is your stuff, not my stuff. All of that. So that's a little bit of what I'm picking up on. I would love to hear like a few more examples of like what it could look like to misuse these skills in a way that seems well-meaning, but like it actually isn't.
Well, I think the sort of unfortunate elephant in the room, and I'm pretty familiar with the elephant because I'm in an organizational leadership program and I'm taking a critical perspective. And most of the time when I drop discussion board posts, nobody wants to engage with them because the problem is, we talk a lot about the self-serving interests that can sort of come in and like derail, and we misuse things and stuff. And I think that's all really valid. Everything you just said, I agree with. And also, sometimes the interests are system serving. And because most organizations operate with power asymmetry, and because commercial and corporate organizations operate with profit margins in mind and they're in service to stakeholders, that the manipulation feels, and this is where we kind of enter into, a lot of the research that I've done is on cult dynamics. And whenever I bring up the C word, people sort of shut down a little bit because they're like, well, if it's not a cult, I'm not in a cult, so I don't need to hear about any of this, which I wholeheartedly disagree with because it's just amplifications of things that are operating all the times. And one of the things that is really key when we're looking at cult dynamics, the mission becomes like the heart of everything, right? It's the heartbeat that everything is serving. And often that mission centers around some sort of ideology that gets created, dogmatic ideology. So that's in a cult situation. If we take and apply that lens to a corporate situation, an organization, and we say, what if the ideology is the bureaucracy, the rationalization that tells us that certain interests have to be served no matter what? Then it gets really complex because the examples I could give you have to do with the way in which we gaslight our followers. And I say this as somebody who did it. I'm going to give you another, more of a micro example in a second. But the way that we gaslight our followers in order to get them to buy in, and we sort of teach them to colonize their own psyches, right? We teach them how to buy into the identity, to buy into the social norms, and the mission becomes a part of who they are. We don't have to use emotional intelligence against them. They're doing it. They're doing it themselves. We've taught them how. And I think that's what I'm most interested in, quite honestly, is the way in which we've accepted certain things, that hierarchies are normal, that certain people have more value than others and they should get paid more. Like all these things that we don't like to talk about because they're not comfortable for leaders to talk about are the things that make these types of dynamics slow burn, develop, and become problematic. And yeah, so I mean, I'll share that and I can stop there if you want. And then I can give you a more specific example to when I was in wellness, like what I did specifically.
Yeah.
Would you like me
let's
to speak
go there.
now?
Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah.
So to give an example that's connected more to when I came out of the organization and what I had learned to do. So I became a coach. And I started to, in addition to doing educational consulting for other mind, body, fitness organizations, I had my own practice. And I went to all these online business training programs to learn how to monetize and create sales funnels and do all of these things. And if I give you, there's a lot of, I think, issues with sales funnels because of the way in which we are encouraged, at least how I was encouraged to build them. There's an element of bait and switch that's happening throughout the whole entire process. But I won't even speak to that. I'm going to speak really plainly to the way in which I was taught to speak to my quote unquote followers. And it really came from how I had learned to lead, which was I'm going to send these like love bomby emails where I'm like talking to them like they're my best friends. And I'm actively creating a parasocial bond with people who I don't know personally, but they're going to feel like they know me personally. And I'm going to make sure they do. I mean, I wasn't conscious of this, but I was like oozing out this ooey gooey, like, I don't know, like the way I spoke to my followers, I for sure can look back and say I was love bombing them into buying in, and many of them did. And then I had to extricate myself from those relationships later on when I decided not to do this anymore, because I had created a dependency. Because why did I create a dependency? Because that's the only way I was going to make money. And there was a point at which I said, I'm doing these coaching programs. This feels icky. I was starting to feel all the same things again, right? But I was the one leading the charge. And I said, you know what? I'm going to pull all my programs. I'm not going to do this. It just doesn't feel right to me. And I hemorrhaged money. Like my whole coaching business just folded because I couldn't stay in my integrity and market in the way that I needed to in order to keep people around. And that's when that was in about 2018 that I had built this, I'd finally arrived with my coaching practice. And I realized I feel so out of my integrity because my whole message to people was about personal agency, right? And self-expression. And I'm doing these things that are actually for the purpose of my capitalistic endeavors, eroding those things. And it just felt gross. And that's when I cut my losses and traveled abroad for 4 months because I just didn't know what else to do. So conflicted, I'm telling you.
Amazing. I mean, gosh, what was it that told you this is it? This is not, I can't continue this way?
I think I'm both fortunate and unlucky that it's like we all say we have our personal values we all prescribe to. I'm one of those people who, for me, integrity, if I'm out of integrity, I literally get physically sick. I start to have panic attacks. I have heart palpitations. I'm just a sense of general ennui. Like I was suffering and I knew things were off and I didn't have language for it yet, but I just knew that I just couldn't anymore. And people, I remember getting into, even when I left that first organization, because I had risen through the ranks so quickly and there was this promising track ahead of me. And I remember my dad being so confused and upset that I was leaving. Like, why? You've been financially struggling for all these years since you got out of college and you have this position. Why would you walk away? And I just said to him through tears, I can't be out of my integrity. This just feels off. I can't do it. So it was the same thing 10 years later that I was just and I want to name for anyone listening that it is a privilege to be able to make that choice. 100% a privilege to be able to make that choice. And there are people who are in positions and suffering and experiencing what I experienced on the daily, and they don't have a choice. They can't step away because there are a lot of people relying on them. I'm childless and come from relative privilege, so I was able to do that. And I just want to speak to anyone out there who feels well, that sounds really nice, that I know it's not that easy for a lot of people, which is why I'm so devoted to looking at structural fixes to these situations so that people don't have to make that choice.
Yeah, absolutely. And the piece about the cognitive dissonance, the realization that these are my values with integrity and this feels off or different. Again, first of all, it requires some level of self-awareness that that's what this is. That's what my panic attacks are about. That's what my feeling of discomfort, my nausea when I enter this, situation or whatever that is for you, my gut is telling me. And let's just be honest here also, besides privilege, let's set that aside for just a second. Just the fact of there's more beyond just financial privilege. There's the privilege of being within groups of people that make you feel, quote unquote, like you belong or like whole or whatever that is. And what I have found when I struggle with issues of integrity where something is happening that is so dissonant for me, and this happens actually for quite a number of the clients that I work with that are really clear about their values, is you have to sort of accept that if you're going to sort of follow the path of your integrity, that means you have to also accept loss and sometimes loneliness and disconnecting from groups continuously throughout your life when you realize that they are no longer leaning in with the level of integrity or expectation around the values that you initially thought, if that happens over time. And that can happen over time with this idea of drift, that you describe. And I would love to hear, like, how do you sort of conceptualize, starting with a group where you feel like these are my people. I'm like completely aligned with a mission. I'm passionate about like the focus, and then like what the drift starts looking like over time if it's going against that grain or into a cult-like experience.
Yeah, I really appreciate you naming that. I think it's easy to underestimate the power of belonging and how profound it is for us and what an intoxicant it is in a beautiful way. Most of the time, it is just one of the most wonderful things about being human, and connection is something we seek. And when we find a home in that regard, it's a huge thing to step away from that. And leaving that first organization was one of the hardest things I've ever done in my life, because I had created a community there. And fortunately, the podcast brought me back to those people almost 20 years later, which is incredible.
Wow.
It's been incredibly valuable for all of us. And realizing that we were all, which this sort of connects to the drift, that when we started to unpack our experiences together and realize how many common experiences we had that we never spoke about, and started to use cult dynamics, not because I have some need to prove that I was in a cult. It's still debatable. It depends on what kind of definition you use of a cult, if I ever was in one. I'm not married to whether or not that's true. What's interesting to me is the way that unpacking all that can help us understand the drift, and it can help us understand, like, one of these mechanisms that I'm speaking to is that Alexandra Stein, she's a researcher who studies cult dynamics, and she identified something she calls triple isolation, where we're more in a mission-driven organization. We can experience isolation in three ways. We can experience isolation from the outside world. And it doesn't have to be like a full-blown cult where you're not going home to your family and yada, yada. Just in a sense of there's sort of a water that we're swimming in within the organization that nobody else knows about. And they don't really get it. You know what I mean? Like, you have to be in to understand it. So there's this sense of some part of us becomes fragmented because there's a part of us that's sort of married to that social world inside. So isolation from the outside world, isolation from one another within the system. And this is where it really depends on how the coercive control is working. And when I say coercive control, I'm talking about soft power, subtle things, not, obvious domination. So what we realized when we started unpacking our experiences is that we didn't talk about the problems we were having because we were taught not to complain. That was like one of the tenets of the practice. And we were taught to, do our own work and to not talk about other people, and gossiping's bad. And like all these things that we had internalized that actually would have kept us safe were things that ended up keeping us isolated from each other. And then the third piece is isolation from self. And this is where, and this can happen in any kind of organization, can certainly happen in a domestic relationship or in a family dynamic. We experience what Dr. Janja Lalich calls doubling, where we have sort of our inside self and our outside self, like who we present and our representative, and then what's really going on inside of us. And if we do that enough, we actually stop hearing the voice inside. We become so good at perfecting the presentation that we're no longer connected to that inner voice. And that happens in cults, but it also happens in everyday relationships. It happens in social cliques. It happens in countries. It happens everywhere. So as far as the drift goes, that's one piece of it, right? Is that we can have this isolation experience. But the mission itself, or the drift itself, as it's related to a mission-driven organization, I think the questions really are about, like, am I putting myself behind the mission? Like, not just to power it, but like, are my needs subjugated to the mission to such a degree that maybe I should pause and reassess? Do I see somebody else? And this is a big thing I really want to emphasize to folks, like whether you're a leader or in any position within an organization, like we need to reflect to each other what we see. We need to be brave enough to say, hey, it sort of seemed like, when we were talking at lunch yesterday, you said X, Y, and Z, but then in the meeting you didn't. Like, are you like, what's going on? Like, can I support you? Like, can we figure out a way to express what it is you want to express? Like, those types of things don't happen because we feel like, well, the mission matters more than my comfort. And also groupthink, which the more homogenous the group, we know that, right? In the research, like the more homogenous the group, more likely groupthink's going to kick in. Also, the more married to the mission we are, the more likely it's going to kick in. The more the mission is like forefront and celebrated. It's not, this is one of the key things I want to emphasize. It's not about a bad leader imposing their will and therefore the mission becomes a thing we subjugate ourselves to. The leader might be subjugated to it as well, right? Like it's more complex than that, I guess is what I want to say. So the drift, there's a lot of places that I can go with like describing how the drift happens. But the key is to understand that nobody's deciding, oh, now I'm going to be coercive, or now we're going to, start moving towards on the other side of this cultish spectrum. It's just something that slowly happens if we don't have awareness around social psychology, if we don't have awareness around power asymmetry. That's a key ingredient. When power asymmetry is denied and people are expected to behave as if it doesn't exist, I think that contributes to the drift in one of the most profound ways.
Interesting. One thing that I want to pull out from the second part of the triple isolation is, there's a concept by Patrick Lencioni, artificial harmony, that we talk about within the world of team development, that we want to avoid artificial harmony because it can be just as destructive as overt aggressive conflict. And what does it look like? Well, it looks like well-meaning, kind, thoughtful, empathetic leaders and team members who want to get along, but the getting along just to get along supersedes getting concerns out in the open and challenging, or questioning whether an idea has merit or not, because you're worried about the judgment of each other's ideas, but you're also worried about offending somebody or stepping on toes or insulting somebody. It makes it very personal. And so in order to avoid somebody else taking it personally, you just don't say anything at all and you maintain artificial harmony. And, one thing that I'm hearing is this very challenging tightrope around, on the one hand, you want to send the message as, somebody who wants to have a positive work culture. Hey, let's not gossip and let's not rumor and let's not have a meeting after the meeting about how awful the meeting was. Let's bring it into the meeting, and at the same time, that could lead to some of the same things that you talked about that could be worrisome about, oh gosh, we shouldn't talk about this together, because if we do, then we're contributing to rumors and gossip and bad culture. And so that causes more social isolation around problematic behaviors. How do you make sense of, or how do you sort of balance the good parts of not feeding into artificial harmony with also avoiding the bad parts of the impact of not talking about things that need to be talked about?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think it kind of circles back and connects to emotional intelligence and applying those tools in constructive ways. So that if you are, teaching a group about emotional intelligence and we're asking them to apply it, then part of the skills of emotional intelligence are to express what we're feeling and to be self-aware and to be regulated and to not point fingers. And so a lot of the things that we're trying to avoid by saying don't gossip and we don't want it to be a rumor mill and don't have a meeting after the meeting is because there's a lacking of skills in terms of dealing with it directly. So one is empowering everyone within the organization with those skills and that sense of mediation. But two, and this is the trickier part, I think, I say this as somebody who grew up in those spaces, because that can be really tricky in and of itself. But the trickier part from a leadership standpoint, I should say, is that leadership has to somehow walk again, that tightrope around, okay, we understand there is power asymmetry and people will be just innately, they're going to feel reticent. They're going to feel wary about having these conversations, saying these things to us. And it is our job to actively encourage that, to actively ask for that, to call on the person who has the least amount of power first in the meeting so that they speak, so that people who are most marginalized have a voice first. And then we fill it in, from the bottom up, to actively do something when a concern is raised, shift something culturally, take an action and not just make it about the lip service of psychological safety. Yes, you can say the thing, but we're not going to do anything about it. To follow through, we have to teach the people around us that it's safe to do that. There was a reason, if I look from the lens of where I used to be in the wellness world on those of us who didn't speak up, I would say, as our leaders would say to us, you just didn't have the personal power to speak up in those. And that's why you didn't share with each other. And that's why you didn't share with us. But if I look from the vantage point I'm looking at it now, it was not psychologically safe for us to do that, to speak to each other about it, because we had been taught to police one another, and or definitely not to speak to leadership about it. So it is a tricky thing, though, when power is at play. Like, how do we create those kinds of spaces? And I think it takes a lot of emotional labor on the part of the leaders. And what wellness programs can sometimes do is come in and say, hey, followers, you need to really become more courageous. And I just want to be clear. I love Ira Shaleph's work. I think it's so important and critical, and it's highly valuable. And also the structural support and the onus on leaders to actually not deflect responsibility and accountability onto followers when culture shifts and changes need to happen, when there's dysfunctional dynamics. The leaders need to own that and like work on it from their perspective. And I think that those things can get kind of convoluted, and it becomes even more emotional labor for the follower to then do on top of everything else to try to fix the culture when it really shouldn't be their job.
Yeah, absolutely. It's both, right? So Ira Chalef, I mentioned, he came on my podcast before. He has many amazing books and presentations. One of them, which is The Courageous Follower. And it's about the idea that followers need to develop the courage to push back, right? It's just as much everyone's responsibility for creating a healthy environment, but also that happens in a situation where you have enough of a relationship or privilege to be able to speak to the right level of leadership to create change. And that leader then is receptive to you to be able to do that. And that's like the key there, is that the leader needs to be receptive to the feedback from a courageous follower, and also needs to do something with that information that changes the system. So this is like the missing piece when we talk about psychological safety. Often we only talk about one component, which is, I feel safe speaking up. Well, here's the reality. I, Mira Brancu, feel safe speaking up in lots of spaces. It doesn't mean it's worth it to me to speak up, because there have been plenty of times when I've spoken up over and over and over and over again and nothing's changed, at which point I stop speaking up because I'm tired of nothing happening. And that is the danger zone, because what does that mean? I stop speaking up, I hold back, I then look like I'm content when in fact I'm disengaged. Right? And so the issue here that you're touching upon that can create a healthier culture is, if I'm going to, as a leader, ask for your feedback, for your input, because I'm trying to create a psychologically safe environment, then I have to also be willing to do something with that feedback that is meaningful to create the change that you asked for, right? And maybe I might conceptualize it differently. Maybe I might have a different perception. That's fine. But then like being able to continue that conversation into some kind of action, some kind of change. So let's sort of like start moving into a little bit more on that. Let's say culture has drifted, right? I'm not realizing as a leader that something needs to change. But I want to have a genuinely healthy culture. What does that actually look like in practical ways? What should I be adjusting as a leader? What should the structure look like? And especially in an environment where I can't just, tear it down, and, the hierarchy is going to be there, the bureaucracy is going to be there, the power dynamics are going to be there. What would you sort of imagine as the sort of adjustments that are necessary to avoid that further drift or make it even worse?
Yeah, this is an open question that I'm like living inside of right now. That is part of why I decided to pursue a second master's degree, honestly, because I wanted to pick it all apart more, to say, like, I want the answer to this question. I had a colleague, a former colleague, who was really involved in the podcast. She came on as a guest at one point and was sharing it. And she started doing activist work in the last year or so. And she reached out to me on a Signal chat and she said, Candice, like, the culture series was so helpful and we did so much important work. And there's like over 200 hours of content, because I have a Patreon where we did all this supplemental stuff. And it's a we project. That's how we talk about it. Like, we did this together. And she's like, you're in this leadership program. Like, can you recommend a book to me that will tell me how to do this different? And I remember I was walking on the trail when I heard her audio message, and I just started laughing because I was like, this is part of the problem, is that we want there to be a formula that's going to apply well to everything. And the issue is that I think that things that need to happen to approach to sort of course correct when we feel the drift happening, there's so many facets to it, and it depends so much on context. It depends so much on the nature of our organization, the org chart that we're operating within, the demographics, the culture. Like, there's so many variables that come into play in terms of like how to address the drift. But having said that, I think the overarching answer really is that we need to be prepared to not know. We need to be prepared as leaders to not be the end all be all solution to everything, as we've been trained to think of ourselves. We need to understand that that's not actually what leadership is. It's not an identity that is projected upon us that we are meant to fix things. It is in fact an event that we collectively experience. And that if we want, I think the biggest thing, if you want to address a drift, is to learn to let go of being the leader and share the leadership and start to think of it as something that everyone does. And how do I empower the people around me? And I don't even like the word empower anymore because it's been appropriated by wellness and turned into something fluffy. But like, how do I activate a culture where I am not the one calling all the shots, and where I'm asking way more questions than I am giving commands. And I am starting with the voices who get listened to the least, and I'm asking them the most questions. And I'm asking them, like, the answers are there. Like, if somebody had asked me and my colleagues years ago how to shift the culture, we could have told them. We could have said X, Y, and Z, walk the talk, like this, that. Like, we know what it's like being us. Like, let us share with you. Like, I think the answers are easier to get than we think. It's the application of them that gets confusing because, Mira, of what you said, like the bureaucracies that we're working under. And I do have a tremendous amount of empathy for leaders who are trying to shift cultures, because it's so difficult when the system is working against you. You're literally kicking against a current. And so the other side of it is that we have to do the work to change the systems. And that's the hard conversation. That is why I'm doing this degree program, because it's like, how do we do that? How do we actually change the systems bit by bit, so that we're not going to be able to like apply a turnkey solution to anything that I'm talking about. But if we look 10 years from now, we see a noticeable difference, like less cultures drifting. That's pretty cool. Like, what are we doing? Well, we're going to have to figure that out together. And I wish that I had like easy answers for y'all, but I can tell you like what a healthy culture might feel like as opposed to what I experienced. So I think one piece is and this is potentially just from my perspective, but some of you might agree with me. A healthy culture doesn't paper over power asymmetry. It acknowledges that it's there, acknowledges that it's operating. It's a kind of leader who says, listen, I know you might be really nervous to tell me about this because of X, Y, and Z, but like, I'm encouraging you to, and I want you to know there won't be any repercussions. Like, that acknowledges power imbalance. I think that that's something that makes people feel safe. It makes people understand, like, there's roles here and nobody's in denial that they're operating, and like, we're just going to speak openly about it. I think it's a culture that authenticates rather than creates a lot of clones. So if you look around your workplace and everyone sort of talks the same and dresses the same and eats the same and has similar sorts of feedback, and you can feel that like groupthink has kind of eroded the culture, that's the opposite of what we want. So healthy culture is diverse. It's people have maybe conflicts and tensions and disagreements, but they're handled in a healthy way. Like, it's like what we would want the world to look like if we all actually learned how to communicate and live in harmony. But often harmony, if you're familiar with the Buddhist concept, near enemies, I love this concept where it's like something that the people think of as like a virtuous solution to something, but it's actually the opposite. Like what you were talking about. What was the term that you used, Mira?
The artificial harmony, that one?
Yes, the artificial harmony. So that artificial harmony is actually getting in the way of what true belonging would be and connection. So there's a welcome to dissent, and the tools of emotional intelligence and mindfulness and things of that nature are actually used to help people to flourish and not put in service to their exploitation. That's a big key ingredient. And you can really, I think that most leaders can look around their organization and honestly answer the question, like, this thing I'm asking this person to do that I'm using this sort of wellness jargon for, like, what is it in service to really? Like, I think asking ourselves that question over and over again can help with the drift quite a lot, because the drift is in service to something other than the people to whom we're there to serve as leaders.
Yeah. Yeah. I love all of this. I would add that, number one, a lot of this sounds like it falls under, some of the work around adaptive leadership, right? Adaptive leadership is letting go of the doing and the control and the direct impact that you previously had in earlier leadership roles, and recognizing that the only way to have a greater and greater impact is to believe that the solutions are in the hands of the people most directly impacted and impacting the outcomes, and therefore asking a lot of those questions that you mentioned. And at the same time, in order to avoid what you mentioned, Candice, earlier in our talk about, like, then only handing it off to your team leaders to just take care of. You had an example that you shared with me before this about, like, a colleague in academia whose institution asked faculty to just, like, step up and right the ship and address the leadership challenges in order to avoid just placing it back on the person to fix, recognizing, okay, they have a couple of potential solutions that they're offering. Now it's my job to use my resources, my power, my influence, my political capital, everything that I've gained by being in this leadership role to make the things happen, to leverage those resources that we've decided make sense together, right? And so it's not like abdicating full, quote unquote, power, to people who don't have the resources to actually make it happen. And it's not avoiding decisions. You must still make decisions. You must still sort of move things forward within the context of what you know will and will not work, the culture, the politics, et cetera, et cetera. But it's knowing what those levers are and using those levers to be able to make the things happen that you've just been asking your team members to give you feedback on that aren't working, that are problematic.
Yeah. Well said. Yes. Yes to all of that. And I think that piece around really emphasizing that as a leader, your leader position is about making people's jobs easier, not adding more to their plate. And that becomes complex, though, because maybe the people above you aren't making your job any easier. And then you become in this codependent dance where you're, doing all the labor, in which case, we need to take all of this and apply it up a level, right? It should, and it does spill from the top down generally. It's usually how those kinds of things works. So,
yeah. I'd like to close out with one thing. So I mentioned adaptive leadership, but you also talk about transformational leadership, the dark side of transformational leadership specifically. What is the shadow side, the dark side of transformational leadership? Because we talk about transformational leadership like it's the end all be all. If you could just do this, you'll be golden. But I never even thought that there would be a dark side. So I'm like super intrigued by this as well.
I want to recommend, because even that language is borrowed from a book by Torish called The Dark Side of Transformational Leadership. I highly recommend it. It is wonderfully researched. It's a beautiful book. And it was like, when I read it, because it gave so much language to what I experienced. Because the leaders that I worked for, all of them that I had these experiences with were transformational leadership leaders. And when I came out and I heard everybody saying like how wonderful it was, I thought, that's weird. That's not the experience that I had. I think what's important to really note is that, and Torish talks about this in his book, like, the transformational leadership framework, like when it was developed, it, interestingly enough, and not coincidentally, coincides with the same moment when the human potential movement came onto the scenes, when gurus became a thing, when cults became like a mainstream thing. Like, it all happened around the same time. And another great book that I would recommend is by Dr. Suze Wilson. She's out of Massey University in New Zealand. She wrote a book called Thinking Differently About Leadership, where she traces the history of leadership theory. It's fascinating. It's based on her dissertation. And she notes a similar turning point. And the way that both of those authors and researchers frame it, which I tend to agree with, is that transformational leadership in many ways is a laundered version of trait theory. It's a sort of zhuzhed up, shined up version of it. Because often what happens, even though we make a bunch of noise around how we want it to function, the way it tends to function over time is that it puts leaders in a position of almost divine-like authority. Like that they're the ones who know how to, even transformation, they know how to transform everything. And the transformation becomes sort of the Kool-Aid, if you will. And everyone's hopped up on the mission and following and the leader and all this stuff. And even if the leader is extremely, and I've worked under some extremely humble, emotionally intelligent, self-aware leaders, over time, the leader is changed by transformational leadership. Over time, a little bits of narcissism because they're absorbing this messaging so much that no one's immune to that. And they start to sort of operate in a way that they maybe wouldn't otherwise because of the way it's framed, the way everything is framed. So one of the dark sides has a lot to do with the way that that leaders are affected, but also the flip side is the way that followers are. And this is borrowing from the language of both Wilson and Torish, are colonized. Their psyches are sort of colonized by the language of the organization. And then they become their own oppressors. They become their own gatekeepers, right? So it's tricky because it's not to say transformational leadership is a terrible thing. It's to say, and I want to just pause here and say, a lot of times when people think about critiques of transformational leadership, they say, oh, so you're talking about transformational leadership's a problem because there's bad apples. Well, we'll just make sure we don't hire those bad apple leaders. And I'm saying, no, I ended a friendship during the culture series with somebody who I loved and adored, who became a transformational leader. And it eroded her sense of self in a way. And she became so high on her own supply that she wasn't even available to me as the person that I loved anymore. It can change people.
And can you describe, when you talk about trait theory and transformational leadership, what is it that in the public domain, public eye, how is that understood first?
So, and I definitely encourage people to check out Wilson's book if you want to read more about that. But to put it plainly, back in the time of Aristotle and when trait theory was sort of developed, the idea was their leaders are sort of imbued with certain traits that a leader is somebody who checks the boxes, has all these qualities, and is therefore destined to lead. And transformational leaders are often sort of described in similar ways. A transformational leader is charismatic. A transformational leader is you might even take these positive things, emotionally intelligent, whatever. It could be really wonderful traits, but then they're pedestalized. And they are seen as something other and better than the people who follow them. And that creates problems over time. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And, my understanding of transformational leader is that also you learn how to coach people into being their best selves. You are able to identify their greatest strengths and learn how to help them show up at their best. I'm wondering if this is part of the potential problem is this superhuman ability to read what is, a strength in somebody else, to extract that and turn it into something else or mold it into something else. Is that part of it?
Yeah, I think that's a good piece to pick apart a little bit. Yes, I think it's about, there's sort of a question underneath both of those skills is who decides what those qualities are? Is the person deciding what those qualities are that makes them effective? Or is the leader deciding the qualities that they need to be molded onto? And then secondly, what are those qualities placed in service to? That's one of the key elements. When we talk about the colonization, we say, okay, I was molded to be very self-aware and regulate myself. And so I was great on TV appearances for this organization. I was really good for all these different things that they utilized me for. It was positioned as if it was in service to me and my agency, but it was in fact in service to the organization's end point. Does that make sense?
Yeah. That makes a lot of
That's the
sense.
difference, I think. Yeah. So again, that's why I say when you look at like sort of a phrase to carry with you at the end of this conversation is really like continually asking, like, what is this in service to? That this thing that I am doing, this tool that I'm applying as a leader, like that's really the question, because all of the things we're talking about are really wonderful when they work functionally. All of it is good.
And just to sort of clarify, it doesn't sound like you're saying, well, because it's in function to the organization, it's bad. It's really about like the extractive or exploitive nature of it, correct? And so then what feels, how, if I was somebody who's like starting to question, like, am I being misused in some way? Am I in this situation? What is the thing that feels exploitive or extractive, and it's only in service to the system or the organization, but really is taking away from who I am as a person?
Yes, there's a sense, and I think that we each have a different experience around that. And like, it's going to vary for each one of us, like where that line is in the sand, but I think we can each sense it and suss it out. So yeah, just really asking like, what is this, the leader asking, what is this in service to, but also the follower saying like, what is this in service to? And am I okay with that? Because you might be like 100%, like I'm okay with that. And also being aware of the fact that sometimes we convince ourselves of things. And so that's where the emotional intelligence comes in. And just making sure that we're using our emotional intelligence in ways that are actually constructive to everyone involved. And it's going to get messy sometimes. Like there's no like, clear lines around any of this. And sometimes we are going to make sacrifices. I'm not on any sort of high horse saying that like we should never feel exploited and this, that, and the other. It's just about like seeing things as it is and having a more transparent point of view around all of this is really all I'm advocating for at this point, so that we can then maybe drift things back in a more favorable direction over time.
Yeah, absolutely. Excellent. As we close out, is there anything else that you want people to know before we close out about your thinking around this, and then also where they can find out more about your work?
Well, first, I just want to thank you for having me here for this conversation. I want to just be transparent myself and say that this is very new terrain for me to be talking about these things in relationship to organizational leadership, now that I've sort of just come out of processing all of it and I'm learning about it. So I just want to say to folks, like, this is an ongoing conversation for me. And I am really grateful for Mira, for you giving me the opportunity to just sort of think out loud with you around all of this. And I am really open to anybody's feedback, comments, questions, anything. And you can find me at thedeeperpulse.com. And Candice at thedeeperpulse.com is my email address. And I'm sure we'll link to some of the places I'm at on social media. I'm not actively podcasting right now because one of the things that I guess I'll just sort of add this last piece. I think sometimes when we are able to step away from the identity of leader and we understand that leadership is an event and an activity, that means that sometimes we go away. And that's what I've been doing. I've been just really focused on my studies and whatnot. And I think as a final piece, I just want to say to people, like, even if you see yourself as a leader, and again, there's nothing wrong with that identity. I think it's a beautiful thing. Just understand that you're so much more than that. And that everyone around you is also a leader. And that these structures that we work within, just hold it all really lightly, like hold it all lightly and, think about the drift, not just in terms of like me as leader, I need to fix this, but talk to your community, your organization, the people you work for and with you about these types of dynamics. Ask them, like, what do you think? Do you think groupthink is happening here? Like, what could we do about it? Like, make it more fun and playful. And you can even use the cult language in a goofy way. Because people are, as somebody who's done a lot of work in that domain, people gravitate toward any mention of the word cult, but they disidentify with it immediately. But it can be a good doorway into a conversation. Like, do you think things are a little culty around here? What do you think? Like, just do a little brainstorming session about it and you'll get some laughs and you might learn some things. So that's the last piece I'll leave people with.
I love all of that. Audience, what did you take away from today? And more importantly, what is one small change, whether that it's a mindset or an action that you could implement this week based on what you learned from Candice? You can share it with me on LinkedIn. And, we'd love to cheer you on wherever you share that. You can contact her. She shared her contact information. If you like this episode, if you enjoy the show, please subscribe. You can subscribe YouTube channel. You can subscribe on the Hard Skills podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. And folks, together, we will figure this out. We will navigate the complexities of leadership and emerge stronger on the other side. Thank you for joining Candice Schutter and me today on this journey. This is Dr. Mira Brancu signing off. And until next time, stay steady, stay present, and keep building those hard skills muscles. Take care, everybody.